The snow came hard and fast that night. Thick, swirling sheets that turned the Arizona rim country into a white wilderness. It wasn't supposed to snow like this, not in late March, but the mountains didn't care. They swallowed everything. The sky, the road, and the hearts of the travelers who dared to cross them. Clara Sutton clutched her wool shawl tighter, though it did little against the biting wind. Her breath came out in white clouds as she stumbled beside the wagon, boots sinking into the drifts. She had been walking for hours, her legs aching, her hands numb. The storm had turned the trail into a blur of snow and shadow. The others, 6 settlers, rough men with grim faces and a single family with a sick child, had stopped speaking to her hours ago. They didn't want her there. "Can't keep dragging her along," someone muttered from the lead wagon. "She slows us down. We'll all freeze before we reach Pine Creek." Clara heard them but said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse. Her husband, Jonathan, had been the one they respected, a preacher with a soft voice and a heart too good for this world. When he died of fever 2 weeks earlier, the others had looked at her differently, as if she were a burden they'd inherited. A woman alone, no man to vouch for her, no strength left in her arms. By nightfall, the wind howled like a living thing. The wagon wheels froze solid. The horses cried out, hooves slipping on the ice. Then the leader, a grizzled man named Boone, made the decision. "We make camp here. But she ain't staying with us." Clara stared at him through a curtain of snow. "You can't mean that," she said, her voice trembling. Boone didn't look at her. He just spat into the snow and said, "You'll slow us down. We'll come back when the storm breaks, if you're still alive." They left her no food, no fire, not even her husband's coat. Just a half-empty water flask and the memory of everything she'd already lost. When the last wagon disappeared into the blizzard, silence fell. Deep, suffocating silence. Clara sank to her knees, snow covering her skirts, and for the first time since Jonathan's death, she let herself cry. The storm only grew worse. The wind clawed at her face, freezing her tears before they could fall. Her body shivered violently, exhaustion creeping through her limbs. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. She thought of her husband's final words. "God will guide you west, Clara, don't be afraid." But now even God seemed to have turned away. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in the storm. She wandered aimlessly, clutching Jonathan's locket close to her chest, whispering his name like a prayer. Snow blinded her eyes. Her lips turned blue. She thought she saw the faint glow of firelight ahead, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Then she fell. The snow caught her softly, like a cold blanket. She was too tired to fight it anymore. Her fingers curled around the locket as she lay there, the wind howling through the pines. So this is how it ends, she thought, not with a prayer, but with silence. But through the haze of half-consciousness, a sound reached her ears, the distant beat of hooves, slow, steady, coming closer. A figure emerged through the storm, tall, dark, wrapped in fur and rawhide. For a moment she thought death had come for her, but when he knelt beside her she saw eyes, dark, solemn, filled with something she didn't understand. Strong arms lifted her from the snow. The warmth of another human being, one of the first she'd felt in days, surrounded her. He spoke words she couldn't understand, low and steady, a language foreign yet comforting. Clara tried to open her eyes, to ask who he was, but the world tilted and went dark. When she woke, she was lying beside a fire, wrapped in a heavy blanket that smelled of smoke and cedar, and somewhere in the shadows the man sat watching her, silent, unmoving, an Apache warrior, and he had saved her life. When Clara Sutton woke, the world was quiet. No storm, no wagon wheels, no men shouting at her to move faster, only the crackle of a small fire and the faint scent of pine smoke and something earthy. Wild herbs maybe, or animal hide. She blinked, disoriented. Her body ached, her lips were cracked, and her skin burned from frostbite. For a long moment she thought she'd died, until she realized she could feel the rough wool of a blanket around her shoulders and the flicker of warmth on her face. Then she saw him. He was sitting a few feet away, cross-legged beside the fire. His dark hair hung loose to his shoulders, streaked with snowmelt. His face was unreadable, strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of old mahogany. His chest was bare beneath a deerskin vest marked with old scars. An Apache. Fear shot through Clara like lightning. She pushed herself up, wincing, clutching the blanket tight around her. "Stay away," she rasped, her throat raw from the cold. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Only watched her. Calm, patient, like a man waiting for a frightened animal to decide whether to run or not. Her heart pounded. All her life she'd heard stories of Apache raids, of settlers taken, of blood spilled on the frontier. The men in her wagon train used to tell those tales around the fire, their voices low and grim. But this man, he didn't look like the monster they'd described. He looked human, tired. Finally he spoke, his voice low, rough, and accented. "You cold. No walk." He gestured toward her feet, then to the fire. "Warm." Clara swallowed hard. Where am I?" He shook his head slightly, not understanding all her words. Then after a pause he said, "Mountain. Safe. Safe." The word hung in the air like a fragile promise. She looked around. A small cave, tucked deep in the forest. Firs lined the walls. Snow drifted outside the entrance, but the fire kept the cold at bay. Her wet dress hung on a stick near the flames, drying. A leather pouch and a clay pot sat beside the man. His few possessions, she guessed. He rose slowly, moving with the silent grace of a hunter. Clara flinched, but he didn't come close. Instead, he knelt by the fire and poured something from the pot into a wooden bowl, a thin broth that smelled of sage and venison. He held it out to her, her stomach clenched with hunger, but pride, or fear, kept her frozen. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. He frowned slightly, searching for words. "Storm, kill many, not you." He pressed his hand to his chest. Taza, she repeated, tasting the name. He nodded, then pointed at her. "You?" "Clara," she said softly. He tried the word once, carefully. "Kala." Something inside her cracked. Maybe it was exhaustion or gratitude or just the sound of another human voice saying her name with care. She took the bowl from his hands and drank. It was warm and bitter and wonderful. For the next few days, she drifted between fever and sleep. Taza stayed near, sometimes tending the fire, sometimes gone for hours, always returning with water or food. He said little, but his actions spoke. The blanket he placed over her shoulders, the way he checked her frostbitten fingers, the way he moved softly when she stirred from nightmares. Once, she woke to find him sitting outside the cave, looking at the horizon, a lonely figure against the snow. She wondered what haunted him, what loss had carved those shadows in his eyes. When she was strong enough to stand, she tried to thank him. "You saved me," she said, her voice unsteady. He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Storm bad. You live?" "No," she insisted, stepping closer. "You saved me." For the first time, she saw something flicker across his face, a faint, almost invisible smile. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe you saved me too." And just like that, Clara Sutton, the widow left to die in the storm, realized she was not alone anymore. By the time the snow began to melt from the pines, Clara Sutton could walk again. Her hands still bore the marks of frostbite and her body felt fragile, but her spirit had begun to thaw. Each morning, she awoke to the soft crackle of fire and the rhythmic sound of Taza sharpening his knife outside the cave. He spoke little, though she had learned to read the language of his silences. When he was angry, his movements turned sharp and fast. When he was thoughtful, his eyes drifted toward the distant peaks. And when he looked at her, really looked, she felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Still, there was fear between them. Clara was a white woman, a settler's widow, raised to fear the people her husband once preached against. Taza was Apache, a warrior shaped by loss, a man who had every reason to despise her kind. Yet fate had thrown them into the same storm, and now they lived on opposite sides of the same fragile peace. Communication came slowly. Words were few, gestures more powerful. When Clara burned her hand on the kettle one morning, Taza gently took her wrist and pressed a cool salve of crushed herbs against the blister. "Yucca," he said, eyes meeting hers. "For pain?" "Thank you," she murmured, uncertain whether he understood. He did. His slight nod said so. In the evenings, she tried to talk, and mostly to fill the silence. She told him about her late husband, about how they'd traveled west seeking a new start. She told him about the betrayal, the settlers who had left her in the storm. At the mention of them, Taza's jaw tensed and his voice grew low. "They bad men," she hesitated. "Not all of them." His eyes lifted sharply. "All who leave one to die, bad." She could not argue. One day, as the snow began to retreat from the valley floor, Taza gestured for her to follow him. He led her through a narrow pass, the cold air filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. Below them stretched a wide valley, wild and breathtaking. Cottonwoods lined a frozen creek and smoke rose from a cluster of distant lodges. "Home," Taza said quietly. Clara's breath caught. "Your people?" He nodded once. Fear flitted through her chest. What would they think of her? A pale-skinned stranger, the widow of a settler. She'd heard tales of Apache tribes who showed no mercy to outsiders. But the thought of leaving Taza frightened her more than the thought of meeting them. They traveled for hours until the valley opened before them. As they approached the camp, children peered from behind hides and women stopped their work to stare. The men stood tall and silent, their expressions unreadable. Clara's heart pounded. An older woman, her hair silver and braided tight, stepped forward and spoke rapidly to Taza. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tone, sharp, questioning, distrustful. The woman's eyes darted toward Clara, narrowing. Taza replied firmly, his hand motioning toward Clara. Then he turned and met her gaze, as if to reassure her, "It's all right." But it wasn't, not yet. That night, they were given a small hut near the edge of the village. Clara could feel the weight of stares everywhere she went, curiosity mixed with resentment. She helped where she could, fetching water, mending clothing, trying to prove she was no threat. Still, she overheard whispers, a few English words among the Apache tongue. Ghost woman, bad luck. Stormbringer. Only the children seemed unafraid. They laughed when she tried to mimic their language, offered her berries, and tugged at her skirt. Taza watched from a distance, silent as ever, his eyes betraying pride and worry both. One evening, when she handed him a bowl of stew she'd learned to cook their way, she whispered, "Your people don't want me here." He looked at her steadily. "They will see. Storm not take you. You strong?" She shook her head. "I'm not strong, Taza. You are." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "You live when others die. That is strong." Something inside her shifted then. A quiet understanding that strength wasn't just about surviving the storm, but finding the courage to stay in a world that didn't want her. And though she didn't yet belong in his world, part of her already knew she would never truly belong in her old one again. The valley was unlike anything Clara Sutton had ever seen. Nestled between jagged red cliffs and pine-covered slopes, it felt hidden from the rest of the world. A secret pocket of life protected by the mountains themselves. Smoke from cooking fires curled lazily into the air. The scent of roasted maize, juniper, and wild sage lingered on the breeze. Children played near the stream while women pounded grain or stitched hides beneath the afternoon sun. But beneath the beauty lay tension, a quiet, watchful kind that never fully eased. From the moment Clara stepped into the Apache camp, she knew she was not welcome. Conversations halted when she passed. Eyes followed her every move. Some faces were curious, others openly hostile. Even the dogs growled low when she walked too near. Taza kept close. He spoke to his people in low tones she couldn't understand, his posture protective but calm. The elders, 3 men wrapped in deerskin robes, listened in silence. One of them, a tall man with hawk-like features, finally gestured toward Clara, then shook his head sharply. She didn't need to know the language to understand she should not be here. Taza's voice grew firm, almost defiant. The men answered with anger, their hands slicing the air, but Taza didn't back down. After a long, heated exchange, the elders turned away. The matter, it seemed, was settled, at least for now. That night, Clara sat beside Taza's small fire outside the lodge he shared with his younger brother, Nietzsche. The younger man's eyes burned with resentment. He was everything Taza wasn't, quick-tempered, restless, loud. "She no belong," Nietzsche snapped in English, surprising Clara. "She brings soldiers." "Always same," Taza answered in Apache, his tone quiet but sharp. Nietzsche stood abruptly, glaring down at Clara. "You see, you make him weak." Then he stalked off into the darkness. Taza's jaw tightened. "Nietzsche lost much," he said finally, staring into the flames. "White men. Kill our father, burn home." You think all white same? Clara's heart ached. And you? She asked softly. What do you think? Taza was silent for a long time. Storm show me. Not all same. The next days were hard, but Clara worked to earn her place. She fetched water from the icy stream, mended torn moccasins, and gathered firewood. An older woman named Sani, the tribe's healer, watched her closely but said nothing. When Clara offered to help grind herbs or prepare poultices, Sani only nodded once, a small but meaningful gesture. One morning, Sani handed Clara a bundle of dry herbs and motioned for her to crush them. Medicine, Sani said, pointing to her chest. Good heart, Clara smiled faintly. For you? Sani shook her head and pointed to Clara instead. For you. Bad dreams. That night, Clara lay awake beneath the buffalo hide covering, listening to the soft sounds of the camp. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. The firelight flickered against the tent walls, painting shadows that looked almost human. She thought of her husband, of the settlers who'd abandoned her, and of the man sleeping a few feet away who had risked everything to save her. Her heart twisted. She didn't understand what she felt, gratitude, guilt, something deeper. But she knew this. She didn't want to leave. The next morning she woke to shouting. Nige had returned from a hunting trip, but not alone. He dragged behind him a bloodied saddlebag marked with a faded U.S. cavalry emblem. They come, he said grimly. Soldiers near. Taz's expression hardened. The camp erupted into movement, men checking weapons, women gathering children. Why? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Nige shot her a venomous look. Because of you. Taza stepped between them, his voice a low growl. No, not her fault. But Clara saw doubt flicker in his eyes, and it cut her deeper than the cold ever had. That night, the valley no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a place about to bleed. She sat by the fire long after the others slept, watching Taza sharpen his blade beneath the moonlight. The wind carried the distant cry of a coyote, lonely, mournful, a sound that made her chest tighten. And in that moment, Clara understood. The storm that had almost killed her wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The morning dawned clear, the sky a brilliant blue over the red cliffs, but the valley held a tense stillness, the kind that comes just before disaster. Clara Sutton sensed it before anyone spoke. The children were quieter than usual. The dogs growled low, their fur bristling. Even the wind seemed to hesitate among the pines. She was gathering water from the creek when she heard it, the distant thud of hooves. Her heart stopped. Taza had been scanning the horizon all morning, his eyes narrowing. Soldiers, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Before she could ask why, a line of cavalry appeared over the ridge. Men in blue uniforms, swords glinting, horses snorting steam into the cold morning air. Clara froze. The stories she had grown up with, tales of raiding soldiers, came alive before her eyes. Stay behind me, Taza whispered, his hand gripping hers. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Men grabbed bows and rifles. Women bundled children into hidden spots near the creek. Smoke from cooking fires was doused. Clara's stomach churned with fear and guilt. Fear for her life, guilt that the soldiers might have come because of her presence. The first shots rang out. Taza's arrows flew swiftly, deadly accurate. Soldiers fell, their shouts echoing across the valley. Clara ducked behind a log, clutching the locket she wore around her neck, praying silently. Suddenly, a rider broke through the line of warriors. Clara gasped. Taza had been hit. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. He stumbled, grimacing, but managed to pull his horse behind cover. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second. Live, they seemed to say. For hours, the valley became a battlefield. Arrows whistled through the air. Horses screamed. Smoke and dust clouded the sun. Clara watched in horror as the soldiers tore through the camp, striking indiscriminately. Even the smallest child was not spared from their panic. Some of the warriors fought with a ferocity she had never witnessed, a mix of fear and desperation that left her trembling. The soldiers, better armed and trained, managed to push them back. But Taza's people held the line just long enough to protect the most vulnerable. When the cavalry finally retreated, a combination of injury, exhaustion, and the fear of more reinforcements, the valley lay in devastation. Smoke curled from burned huts. Bodies lay scattered across the snow-melted grass. The creek ran red in places, reflecting the morning sun like a cruel mirror. Clara ran to Taza, who was kneeling, one hand pressed against his wound. Blood soaked his shirt, his face pale beneath the dust and grime. "Taza!" she cried, dropping to her knees. He shook his head slightly, grimacing in pain. "I live," he said, his voice strained. "Storm stronger than bullets, you survive." Clara pressed her hands to his wound, tears streaming down her face. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All for me." He looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of something softer appeared in his eyes. "You, no storm yet, must live." She realized then the truth she had been avoiding. The storm that had nearly killed her in the mountains was nothing compared to the one that had descended upon the valley. And just like before, Taza had saved her. Only this time it was not just the wind and snow. It was a human tempest of hatred, fear, and war. As he slumped against a tree, Clara vowed silently that she would never leave him. Never again. She was no longer the fragile widow left behind by careless men. She had been forged by snow, by blood, and by the man who refused to let her die. The soldier's retreat left a valley in ruin, but it also left a bond strengthened. Clara knew that healing would take time, for Taza, for the tribe, and for her own heart. But the first step had been taken. She had survived, and she had not done so alone. Through the smoke and quiet cries, she felt something new, a fragile, stubborn hope. And as she pressed Taza's hand against her cheek, she whispered softly, "We'll survive. Together." The valley was quiet again, though the scars of the raid lingered in every corner. Burned huts, trampled fields, and the low murmur of mourners marked the aftermath. Clara Sutton moved carefully among the wounded, her hands becoming steady in ways she hadn't thought possible. Every scrape, every tear in clothing, every shallow breath pulled her back to the morning when she had first seen Taza fall. He lay in the center of the camp, wrapped in furs, his shoulder bound with strips of cloth and herbs. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the dirt of battle. His eyes, usually so guarded, flickered weakly when she approached. "I should have," Clara began, but her voice broke. She swallowed hard. "I should have stopped this." Taza's gaze met hers, steady despite his pain. "No, storm come. Not your fault." Clara shook her head, frustration and guilt coiling in her chest like a living thing. "Yes, it is. If I hadn't been here, if I hadn't survived the mountains, and they wouldn't have followed us. I brought this danger to you all." He reached for her hand, weak but firm. "You live. You strong. That is enough." But Clara couldn't let it be enough. She spent the next days beside him, preparing poultices, cleaning his wound, changing his bindings. She whispered prayers over him, in the words of her husband's church, though she didn't know if he understood. Sometimes she wept quietly when he slept, mourning not just him, but the children and elders who had been caught in the raid, the homes destroyed, the peace shattered. Taza's eyes followed her every movement. He said little, only occasionally murmuring in Apache, words she couldn't understand, but whose tone carried reassurance, gratitude, and something deeper she could feel in her bones. One evening, when the camp had grown still and the fires were low, Taza spoke in English, halting but deliberate. "Storm take much, but you make strong." Clara knelt beside him, holding his hand. "I'm not strong," she whispered. "I've only survived because you saved me. I couldn't do this on my own." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Then we survived together." That night, Clara finally slept fully without the trembling fear of the past weeks. But even in rest, her mind replayed the raid, the screams, the blood on snow and grass, the faces of soldiers and children alike. Guilt clung to her like a second skin. Every time she looked at Taza, she saw both the man who had saved her and the man who had risked everything. And she wondered if she would ever be able to repay him. As the days passed, she learned more of his world. Taza shared fragments of his life through gestures, pictures, and a few words of English he had picked up over the years. She understood that he had lost much: his parents, his siblings, his home. Yet he carried a quiet dignity and resilience that both terrified and inspired her. The valley's people began to accept her cautiously. Sani the healer allowed her to help with minor injuries, teaching her which herbs to use and how to treat burns. Children lingered near her side, their laughter a fragile balm to her still grieving heart. Even some adults, once suspicious, nodded with acknowledgement when she offered assistance. But she still carried her guilt. Each day, each act of care was tinged with the knowledge that her presence had changed everything. For good, yes, but at a terrible cost. The weight of survival was heavy, and the gratitude she felt for Taza's protection only deepened her sense of obligation. One afternoon, Taza called her to the edge of the valley. He pointed toward the horizon where the snow-capped peaks met the sky. "You see," far lifeweight, storm end. Clara looked at him, taking in the vastness, and felt a flicker of hope. Yes, the valley was wounded, and yes, the shadow of the raid would linger, but life, theirs, the tribe's, would continue. And she realized something profound. Survival was not just enduring the storm, but facing it together, hand in hand with the man who had embraced her when the world had left her to die. And for the first time, she let herself imagine a future not dictated by guilt, fear, or loss, but by the quiet, steadfast love that had begun to bloom in the heart of the storm. Winter returned to the valley with the subtle cruelty of inevitability. Snow dusted the red cliffs and the creek's edges froze once more. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and the earth beneath. For Clara Sutton, it was a reminder that the past never truly left, that danger, like the cold, could return without warning. She had spent months in the Apache Valley now, learning the rhythms of their lives. She could fetch water without spilling a drop, grind maize with precision, and even identify the herbs Sani used to heal wounds. Yet, despite her integration, some part of the tribe still regarded her as an outsider, a ghost of the white world, fragile and unpredictable. Taza, ever watchful, moved beside her as she gathered firewood one morning. His presence was steady, comforting, yet it carried an unspoken tension. He had been wounded in the soldiers' raid, and though he had healed, the scars remained, a reminder that peace was only temporary. "Storm come," he murmured in Apache, then added, pointing at the horizon, "Snow same. Must be ready." Clara nodded. Winter in the Rim country was merciless, and she had learned that survival meant vigilance. But there was another storm gathering, one she could feel in the pit of her stomach. That evening, as the camp huddled near fires and the children listened to stories of ancestors and spirits, Nietzsche appeared. His expression was dark, eyes sharp with resentment. He approached Clara, voice low and tense. "You do not belong here," he said in English, surprising her. "This is our home. Your presence brings soldiers sickness, death." Clara swallowed hard. She had known this confrontation would come. "I am not here to harm anyone," she said quietly. "I help. I learn. I belong where Taza allows me." Nietzsche's lips tightened. "He is blinded by your white skin. He will learn, as we all will, that you are not of us." Before she could respond, Taza stepped between them. His posture was calm but unyielding, a wall of authority that even Nietzsche could not break. "Enough," Taza said, his voice low and firm. "She stays. You will see." The younger man hesitated, then stepped back, jaw tight, but the tension in the camp remained palpable. Clara saw the whispers among the women, the narrowed eyes of the elders, the cautious glances of the other warriors. Even children sensed the unease, clinging to their mothers' skirts as if the winter wind carried judgment. That night, Clara and Taza walked alone along the frozen creek. Their footsteps crunched in the snow, breaking the silence that hung like a veil over the valley. "Do they hate me?" Clara asked softly, voice barely louder than the wind. "They fear," Taza corrected gently. "Fear different than hate. They do not know you. You survive storms they cannot imagine." Clara glanced at him, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "And you?" He studied the creek, then met her gaze. "I fear losing you." Her heart quickened, and for the first time she realized the depth of her feelings. Survival had brought them together, yes, but love, quiet, unspoken, steadfast, had rooted itself in the months of shared hardship, of nights beside the fire, of hands held in silence. Winter would test them, The snow would return, soldiers might return, and the valley itself demanded vigilance. But standing beside Taza, feeling the warmth of his hand against hers, Clara understood something vital. She had chosen to be part of this world, part of his life, and he had chosen her. As the first stars of evening glittered above the cliffs, she pressed her cheek against his shoulder, letting the cold wind whip around them. The storm outside was fierce, but the storm inside her heart was fiercer, a mixture of fear, longing, and undeniable hope. The valley had survived, and so had she. And in that frozen moment, Clara Sutton knew with unwavering certainty that she and Taza would endure, together, against any storm that dared return. The valley had returned to a deceptive calm. The key. Snow-covered cliffs glistened in the sunlight. Streams trickled under frozen edges, and the children's laughter echoed softly among the lodges. But beneath this fragile serenity, tension simmered, not from soldiers or storms, but from the hearts of those who lived here. Nietzsche's resentment had not faded. Each glance, each whispered word to the younger warriors, reminded Clara that her presence was still a challenge. Taza, ever composed, bore the weight of this tension with quiet strength, but she could sense the struggle within him. He was torn between loyalty to his people and the bond he had forged with her. One morning, Nietzsche approached Taza openly, his face red with anger. "You trust her too much," he said. "She brings danger. She is not of us." Taza's eyes narrowed. "I choose. She is my concern." Nietzsche's fist struck the frozen ground in frustration. "Then you are blind. You betray your own people." "For a white woman." The brothers faced each other across the snow-crusted earth, silence stretching taut like a bowstring. Clara watched from a distance, heart pounding, realizing that the conflict between them mirrored the internal storm Taza had carried since the day he found her in the blizzard. The tension exploded that night. In the communal lodge, voices rose, heated words clashing like thunder. Some warriors took sides, others whispered anxiously to the women and children. Clara stayed near the fire, silently praying that Taza would not act rashly. Then, Nietzsche challenged him directly. "If she remains, I leave." His tone left no room for negotiation. Taza stepped forward, placing himself between his brother and Clara. "She stays. She is under my protection. If you strike her, you strike me." The room fell silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind moaning outside. Nietzsche's eyes blazed, but he saw the unwavering resolve in his brother's gaze and realized that he would not back down. After a tense pause, he stormed out, slamming the door against the cold night. Clara exhaled, trembling. Taza's hand found hers in the firelight. "Storm not outside," he murmured. "Storm inside. We weather it together." For the first time, Clara understood the depth of his burden. Taza's world was one of constant vigilance, of survival balanced on a knife's edge. Her presence, once a lifeline, had become a lightning rod for the unresolved tensions within the tribe, and within him. Over the following days, the valley adjusted. Nietzsche sulked, keeping his distance, though he still cast suspicious glances at Clara. The elders accepted her cautiously. Sani continued to teach her medicine, and the children grew bolder, laughing and playing at her side. But Taza carried the weight of the internal storm with him. When the night fell and the wind howled over the cliffs, he would sit alone, sharpening his knife, eyes distant. Clara would join him, sitting close enough to offer warmth, yet not intrude on his thoughts. "You blame yourself?" he asked one evening, voice low. Clara shook her head. "No, I blame myself and everyone who abandoned me. I feel guilty for surviving when others suffered. I cannot stop thinking. If I hadn't been here, the soldiers never would have come." Taza's fingers brushed hers gently. "You could not know. You save what is lost. Storm comes, yes, but you also bring hope. That is strength." Her chest tightened at his words. Hope. Strength. Two things she had never believed she could. Claim for herself, not after loss, betrayal, and the blizzard that had nearly killed her. Yet here with Taza, She began to see them reflected back in her own eyes. That night she lay close to him, wrapped in the same blanket that had first saved her from the storm. Outside, the wind tore across the cliffs, rattling the lodges. Inside, she felt a quiet certainty that together they could face any tempest, whether it raged in the sky or within the hearts of men. The storm within was fierce, but their bond was fiercer. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where love and loyalty could withstand even the most relentless of trials. The first light of dawn spilled across the valley, painting the cliffs in gold and crimson. Frost clung to the trees, glittering in the early sun, while the creek whispered softly as it wound through the snow-covered ground. Clara Sutton stood at the edge of the camp, the cold biting at her cheeks, and watched the new day arrive. It had been months since the soldiers' raid, months of rebuilding, learning and finding a fragile peace among the Apache. She had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the valley, to the whispered songs of the elders, to the laughter of the children who now approached her without fear. And most of all, she had grown accustomed to Taza, to the quiet steadiness of his presence, to the strength that had first saved her in the blizzard and again in the raid. Taza appeared silently at her side, his hand brushing hers. The bond they shared had deepened beyond words, built through survival, trust, and the subtle gestures of care and protection. He had taught her to ride bareback along the frozen ridges, to track deer, and to recognize the healing power of the valley's herbs. And she had taught him, in her own quiet way, the language of laughter, of warmth, of trust that could cross the boundaries of worlds. "You see?" he said softly, pointing toward the horizon where the red cliffs met the sky. "Life weight." Clara's eyes followed his gesture. Beyond the valley, the mountains stretched endlessly, white peaks fading into the morning haze. There was a freedom there, yes, but also danger. She thought of the settlers, the soldiers, the past she had tried to leave behind. And yet, for the first time, she did not feel fear. Only a deep, stubborn hope. "They can't take this from us," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "Not what we've built. Not what we've survived." Taza's gaze softened. "Storm come, always, but you stay. Together, we endure." Her heart tightened at the simple truth of his words. Together. Months ago, she had been left in the snow, abandoned by those she had trusted to protect her. Now she stood in a valley far from her old life, embraced by a man who had risked everything for her. She had found a home, a family, and a protector in Taza, and perhaps in herself a strength she had never known she possessed. The camp began to stir as the sun rose higher. Children ran to the creek, women prepared fires and breakfast, and warriors checked their weapons, ensuring that the valley remained safe. Yet none of this seemed as important as the quiet moment she shared with Taza, standing together in the dawn light, the chill of winter held at bay by the warmth between them. Clara reached for the locket that had carried the memory of her late husband through the storm and across the mountains. She placed it around Taza's neck, feeling his pulse beneath her fingers. "You saved me," she said softly, voice trembling. "But you also saved me from the fear I carried inside. You gave me life again." Taza's hand covered hers, steady and reassuring. "You saved me too," he said, his voice low but firm. "You give reason." A smile touched her lips, the first in weeks that felt entirely her own. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. The wind carried the songs of the valley, the laughter of children, the faint scent of sage and pine. It was a morning of promise, not of storms. Clara realized then that the past could no longer define her. The settlers who had left her to die, the blizzard, the soldiers, all of it had forged her, but it did not control her. Here in the valley with Taza beside her, she had a choice to live fully with courage and to embrace the life she had been given. The sun climbed higher, casting its golden light over the red cliffs and frozen creek, and as Clara tightened her hold on Taza's hand, she whispered once more, this time not to him, but to herself, "We endure together." And for the first time, she believed it completely. The valley was alive with the soft hum of morning. Smoke rose from the lodges in delicate spirals. The children laughed as they skated on the thin layer of ice along the creek, and the elders went about their tasks with quiet determination. Clara Sutton stood at the edge of the camp, the first rays of sunlight warming her face. She had survived storms both literal and metaphorical. The blizzard that had left her for dead, The soldiers' raid that had threatened to destroy the valley, and the internal storms of guilt and fear that had haunted her heart. But this morning brought a new kind of challenge. A line of U.S. cavalry appeared on the distant ridge. Clara's pulse quickened. She had feared their return, feared the soldiers' vengeance, feared for Taza, feared for the valley that had become her home. Taza appeared at her side, silent as ever, yet steady, unwavering. His presence calmed her, grounding her in the knowledge that they would face this together. The soldiers' approach was slow, deliberate, their horses kicking up clouds of snow and dust. The commanding officer, a man with a stern face and sharp eyes, dismounted and approached the camp. Clara stepped forward, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of months of hardship. "I am Clara Sutton," she called, meeting the officer's gaze. "I am here by choice. I was not stolen, I am safe, and this is their home. You will leave in peace." The officer's expression flickered, surprise evident at her command. He studied her, then glanced toward Taza, who remained stoic and silent at her side. The officer nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing the woman who had vanished in the blizzard weeks ago. Without another word, he gestured to his men to mount their horses. They turned, leaving the valley untouched. Clara exhaled, relief washing over her like a warm tide. She turned to Taza, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken but profoundly felt. The man who had saved her twice, who had given her a reason to live, who had been her anchor through months of fear and uncertainty, stood before her, unbroken, steadfast, and hers. The valley seemed to hold its breath as Clara took Taza's hand. His fingers were strong, calloused from years of survival, yet gentle in their grasp. He drew her close, wrapping her in the same blanket that had first shielded her from the blizzard. The warmth of his embrace seeped into her bones, carrying away the last remnants of cold, fear, and doubt. "You were left for dead," Clara whispered, her forehead resting against his chest. "But you embraced me instead." Taza's voice was low, steady, and full of quiet conviction. "Storm left you. I take you always. You live with me." Tears blurred her vision, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of love that had grown quietly, fiercely, and without apology. She pressed closer to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, feeling the strength that had carried her through blizzards and battles. The valley around them stirred. The children laughed. The elders watched with knowing eyes, and the red cliffs glowed in the rising sun. But for Clara, the world had narrowed to this singular truth. She was safe, she was loved, and she had been claimed not by force but by choice. Winter could still return. Storms could still come. The past could never be erased. But in that moment, wrapped in the arms of the Apache warrior who had defied both the storm and the world to save her, Clara knew she had found something far stronger. A home, a family, and a love that could endure anything. She lifted her face to his, their foreheads touching, eyes locked in understanding. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of all the days to come. And with that, Clara Sutton allowed herself to surrender fully, to the valley, to the life she had chosen, and to the man who had embraced her when the world had left her for dead. In Taza's arms, she was no longer a widow abandoned in a blizzard. She was alive, unafraid, and fiercely loved. The storm had passed, and together they would face whatever came next.